Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Okay, so you want to explore authoritarian regimes. Buckle up, because today we're going deep, and I mean spelunking in the archives, deep into how opposition worked or didn't work under two of history's most notorious dictators.
You talking Hitler and Castro.
You got it, Hitler and Castro.
And what's fascinating there is that while their reigns of power are often studied separately, comparing how they each dealt with dissent
With people who disagreed with them.
exactly reveals some striking and, frankly, unsettling similarities.
Yeah, it's kind of chilling when you realize that despite the differences in time, place, and even ideology, there's almost a playbook these regimes follow.
Exactly, a pattern, and recognizing that pattern, understanding how they identify and then neutralize threats, perceived or
Well,
real.
Perceived, so like you didn't even have to actually be a threat.
Right, exactly. Sometimes just a perception of being a threat was enough is essential, especially for anyone who thinks, oh, that could never happen here.
Right. Like, how do you go from a democratically elected party to a full-blown dictatorship?
It's a slippery slope.
We're going to unpack that, focusing on Nazi Germany between 1933 and 1939, and Castro's Cuba from 1953 to 1959, those pivotal years when dissent was truly tested.
A smart choice. Because in both cases, those periods reveal how these dictators consolidated their power, often starting with laser focus on specific groups before widening the net to encompass, well, just about anyone who dared disagree.
And the Nazis didn't waste any time, did they? I mean, Hitler becomes chancellor in 1933, and almost immediately it's like democracy got thrown out the window.
It was shockingly fast. I think a lot of people assume a dictator just seizes power in some dramatic coup, but in Hitler's case, he exploited existing legal systems.
Oh, so it wasn't like some big dramatic takeover?
Not at all. He was sneakier than that.
So how'd he do it?
While also capitalizing on a crisis.
You're talking about the Reichstag Fire, right? It always seemed like such a turning point.
It absolutely was. The fire itself in February 1933 was devastating, but the Nazis, many believe they even orchestrated it, used this event to justify the Reichstag Fire decree.
Okay, for those of us who slept through that history class, what exactly was the Reichstag Fire decree? It sounds very official and not at all ominous.
Right. It sounds almost boring until you realize it essentially handed the Nazis the legal tools to arrest and detain anyone they wanted without trial by suspending basic rights. They went after the communists first. Thousands of them were rounded up, imprisoned, silenced.
And then they came for the Social Democrats. It's like they had a hit list and they were working their way down.
In a sense, they did.
Yeah.
By June of 33, barely half a year after Hitler took power, the Nazis had effectively eliminated their main political rivals. But, and this is where things get really eerie, it didn't stop there.
Because Hitler, and this is putting it mildly, had a bit of a knack for finding enemies.
That right there, that broadening definition of enemy is a hallmark of totalitarian regimes.
So who else became an enemy of the state?
Well, trade unions, for example, were also in Hitler's crosshairs. Remember, these were organizations with the power to organize workers to call for strikes, a direct threat to the Nazis' control.
So what, they just got rid of unions? Like, sorry, no more worker representation for you.
Pretty much May 1933, independent trade unions are abolished, replaced with, wait for it, the German Labor Front, totally controlled by the Nazis, of course.
So not only are you out of a job, potentially, because these regimes often tank the economy, but now you're forced to be part of the very system that took away your voice. That's brutal.
It's a classic move. Dismantle any independent source of power, even those that from the outside might seem inconsequential. Even religious leaders weren't safe from Hitler's paranoia.
Wait, really? What threat could a priest or pastor possibly pose to the Nazis?
You'd be surprised. Remember, this is about controlling all aspects of life. Some religious leaders, especially within the Protestant church, they saw what the Nazis were doing, trying to infiltrate and control religious institutions, and they spoke out against it. The Confessing Church, for example, actively resisted Nazi influence, paid a hefty price for their defiance, too.
Wow, so even faith, something deeply personal, was seen as potential defiance. And of course, we can't forget the horrific systematic persecution of Jews, Roma, and other groups deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime.
Right. It's vital to acknowledge that this wasn't just about silencing dissent. It was about enacting a horrific ideology rooted in hate and discrimination.
It's just horrifying, and it's hard to wrap your head around the scale of it. But how did Hitler enforce all of this? I mean, aside from the terror tactics of the Gestapo and the SS, how do you control an entire nation?
And that's where the truly insidious stuff comes. In March 1933, they passed the Enabling Act.
The Enabling Act, I feel like I should know this one. What was it?
It was essentially a blank check for Hitler. This act bypassed the German constitution, giving him the power to enact laws without any parliamentary approval. Just like that, he could make anything legal, even if it went against existing laws.
Wow. So it wasn't just brute force. It was this legal manipulation, this erosion of rights disguised as something necessary for the greater good. It's terrifying how easily that can happen.
It is, and it's why understanding these patterns is so important. Because while the specifics may change the tactics of authoritarianism, they tend to repeat themselves throughout history.
Okay, so Hitler systematically eliminates his opponents, consolidates his power, and creates this atmosphere of absolute fear. But one question that's always baffled me, why wasn't there more resistance, at least initially?
It's a question historians have grappled with for decades. And it's tempting to reduce it to just fear, but the reality is far more nuanced. You have to remember the state of Germany at that time, recovering from World War I, the Great Depression had hit them hard.
Hyperinflation, unemployment, this deep sense of national humiliation.
Exactly. People were desperate for a way out. And Hitler, he offered a solution. He promised economic recovery, a return to national pride. And for many Germans, especially in those early years, he delivered. Think about the Autobahn, for example, or the massive rearmament programs. These created jobs, boosted national morale.
So it was a mix of fear and, dare I say, hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, Hitler could pull Germany out of this nosedive.
There was an element of that, absolutely. People wanted to believe in a better future. And let's not forget the chilling effectiveness of propaganda. Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, was a master manipulator. He controlled the newspapers, the radio, the arts, everything.
So the average German was basically bombarded with Nazi messages 24/7. No wonder so many bought into it.
Exactly. Goebbels crafted this narrative of national rebirth of Germany rising from the ashes. He painted this picture of a strong, united nation led by a charismatic, almost messianic leader. It was powerful stuff.
It's terrifying how easily propaganda can warp people's perceptions of reality, which actually makes for a really interesting comparison with Castro's Cuba, because he too wasn't always the dictator we know him as. Initially, after overthrowing the Batista regime, he was seen as this liberator.
Absolutely. And like with Nazi Germany, understanding the context is crucial. Cuba under Batista in the 1950s was rife with corruption, inequality, brutality. It was essentially a military dictatorship propped up by the U.S., and it benefited a select few while the majority of Cubans suffered.
So along comes Castro, this young, charismatic, revolutionary, promising social justice and end to corruption. It's easy to see how he captured the hearts and minds of so many Cubans.
Precisely. His 26th of July movement tapped into this widespread discontent, especially among the peasantry and the working class who bore the brunt of Batista's oppressive policies.
But here's the thing that I find really intriguing. Even before Castro took power in 1959, he seemed to have this almost instinctive sense of who his enemies were, almost like he was reading from Hitler's playbook.
It's a shrewd observation, and one that highlights Castro's calculated approach to power. While Hitler faced immediate threats from established political parties, Castro identified three main obstacles early on: Batista loyalists, those entrenched in the old power structures, and perhaps most surprising, some who initially supported his revolution.
Okay, let's break down those groups. Batista's supporters seem like the obvious adversaries, anyone with a vested interest in maintaining that corrupt system.
Exactly. Members of the government, the military, the police, these were individuals and groups who directly benefited from Batista's regime.
And then there's the wealthy elite. I'm guessing they weren't too keen on Castro's whole socialist revolution thing.
Not at all.
Yeah.
These were the landowners, the industrialists, the businessmen who thrived under Batista's corrupt system. Castro's promises of land redistribution, nationalization, wealth redistribution, to them that was a nightmare scenario.
And then there's this third group, people who initially supported Castro but then became disillusioned. That's where things get really interesting, because it's like the revolution starts to eat its own.
It's a tragic and recurring pattern we see throughout history. The clash between revolutionary ideals and the often brutal realities of attaining and maintaining power.
Okay, so Castro's got a target on his back from multiple sides. How does he actually neutralize these threats once he takes power?
He moved with incredible speed and ruthlessness.
Mm.
Remember those Batista loyalists we talked about? Castro made examples of them. Show trials were held, often lacking any semblance of due process, and many were executed.
This was Castro's version of revolutionary justice, right?
Exactly. It was a calculated display of power meant to instill fear and deter any further opposition from that quarter. It's estimated that between 500 and 700 people were executed in the first few years of his regime.
Wow. It's easy to get caught up in the grand narratives of revolution, but that's a stark reminder of the very real, very human cost of these power struggles.
Absolutely. It wasn't just executions. Many more were imprisoned or sent to labor camps. Castro's message was clear. Cross the revolution and you will face the consequences.
And what about the military and the police? They were loyal to Batista. How did Castro deal with them?
He was remarkably effective in dismantling the old guard. He purged the military and police, removing anyone suspected of loyalty to Batista. They were replaced with individuals who proved their allegiance to him in the revolution. Castro understood that a loyal and disciplined armed force was essential to maintaining control.
It's like rebuilding a house. You can't have the old foundation crumbling beneath the new structure. So what about the wealthy elite? How did Castro deal with them?
He targeted their economic power base. Most notably, he implemented the Agrarian Reform Law of 1959.
Ah, yes, the Agrarian Reform. That was a major turning point. Remind us what that entailed and how it impacted those wealthy landowners.
The Agrarian Reform Law essentially broke up large estates and plantations, much of which were owned by wealthy Cubans or foreign corporations. The land was then redistributed primarily to peasants.
So it was a direct attack on the economic power of the elite, all under the banner of social justice.
Precisely. And it resonated with many Cubans, especially the rural poor, who had long suffered under exploitative land ownership.
But for those who benefited from that system, it was a catastrophe.
Absolutely. They saw it as a betrayal, a communist power grab, and many of them fled Cuba, often seeking refuge in Miami.
So through a combination of force and exile, Castro effectively neutralized the three main groups he saw as immediate threats. But then you have those who became disillusioned later on, who felt Castro had betrayed the ideals of the revolution. How did he handle those dissenting voices?
That's where we see the real tragedy of the Cuban Revolution, and, frankly, many revolutions. Individuals who fought alongside Castro, who truly believed in his vision of a more just and equitable Cuba, found themselves targeted when they dared to criticize his methods or his increasingly authoritarian policies.
It's like that saying, the revolution devours its own children.
Exactly. And one of the most well-known examples of this in Castro's Cuba is Huber Matos. Here's a man who was a genuine revolutionary hero, a close confidant of Castro's, who ended up turning against him.
What happened there? Fill me in, because I admit I don't know this story.
Matos is a tragic figure. He played a key role in the revolution, a true believer in Castro's vision. But as Castro consolidated power, as his policies veered towards communism, and as dissent was increasingly suppressed, Matos became increasingly critical. He saw it as a betrayal of the revolution's core ideals.
So what did he do about it? Did he just go into hiding?
No, he spoke out. In 1960, Matos, this war hero, this trusted comrade, he sends Castro a letter. In it, he expresses his concerns about the direction of the revolution, particularly what he perceived as a dangerous drift towards communism and authoritarianism.
Wow, gutsy move. So how'd that go over?
About as well as you'd expect with a dictator, Castro was furious.
I bet.
He accused Matos of treason and had him arrested.
Treason! Just for expressing his concerns. And it was just in a letter, right?
That's the chilling reality of Castro's Cuba. Any form of dissent, even from those who had been instrumental in the revolution, was treated as a threat and active betrayal.
So it wasn't enough to just go along with it. You had to actively and enthusiastically support the regime, or else?
Pretty much. And Matos wasn't alone.
Yeah.
How widespread was this suppression of dissent within Castro's own ranks? It's hard to quantify the true extent of it because much of it happened behind closed doors through subtle forms of pressure and coercion. But Matos' case wasn't an isolated incident. It highlights a broader pattern of silencing anyone, even former comrades, who dared to question Castro's authority.
It's eerie how much this mirrors what we saw in Nazi Germany, that steady erosion of freedom justified in the name of security or national unity. Though you can argue that in Castro's case, given the initial hopes and ideals of the revolution, it's even more tragic.
I agree. And it underscores a grim truth about many revolutions. The very tools used to dismantle one oppressive regime can be used to create another. It's a cautionary tale about the intoxicating nature of power and the delicate balance between freedom and control.
Okay, so we've got these two regimes, both led by dictators who ruthlessly eliminated their opponents, but how did they maintain that control over time? I mean, it's not like they could just rely on brute force forever.
That's where things get really insidious. Both Hitler and Castro understood that to truly control a population, you need to create an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. You need to make people afraid to even think dissenting thoughts, let alone voice them.
You're talking about those secret police-type organizations, right? The kind that make you feel like someone's always watching, listening to your every word, just waiting for you to step out of line.
Precisely. In Nazi Germany, you had the Gestapo, infamous for their brutality and their pervasiveness. They infiltrated every aspect of German society, workplaces, schools, even social clubs. You never knew who you could trust.
It's that classic, it could be you, it could be me, it could even be whispering him.
Right. And that was the point. It wasn't just about actual arrests. It was the constant threat of being watched, reported, denounced often by your own neighbors, colleagues, even family members.
So they turned citizens into informants, encouraging them to betray each other in the name of national security. That's messed up.
It was incredibly effective, though. They instilled this deep sense of paranoia, this fear of even whispering a word of criticism.
And Castro's Cuba had a chilling similar system with the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, or CDRs for short.
Yes, the CDRs were Castro's answer to the Gestapo, though they initially operated under a more subtle guise of community involvement.
Community involvement? Really? How so?
Well, on the surface, they were presented as neighborhood organizations, focused on seemingly benign things, literacy campaigns, vaccination drives, organizing block parties, that sort of thing.
So you're made to feel like you're part of something positive, something communal?
Exactly. But beneath that veneer of community service was a much darker purpose. The CDRs were Castro's eyes and ears, a vast network of informants tasked with monitoring their neighbors for any sign of subversive activity.
Wow, so even a casual conversation about, say, the availability of coffee could be misconstrued and reported.
Absolutely. And by the early 1960s, the CDRs had an estimated 800,000 members. That's a significant portion of the population actively participating in this system of surveillance.
It's amazing, and by amazing I mean terrifying, how both regimes use this tactic of social pressure and surveillance. In a way, it's even more insidious than brute force because it makes you complicit in your own oppression.
It's a chilling reminder that the road to dictatorship is often paved with good intentions, or at least the skillful manipulation of them.
Right. Hitler and Castro both rose to power, promising order, prosperity, a better future. And they both resorted to disturbingly similar tactics, eliminating rivals, controlling information, and instilling fear to stay in power.
And it's a stark reminder, too, that we can never take our freedoms for granted. That we must always be vigilant in safeguarding our rights and challenging those who seek to divide us or erode our freedoms.
Because in the end, it's that courage to question, to dissent, that keeps those in power in check.
Absolutely. History teaches us that silence compliance in the face of injustice is often too high a price to pay.
It really makes you think, what happens when dissenting voices are silenced? Who gets to decide what's best for everyone? Something to ponder the next time you're doom scrolling. Thanks for diving deep with us.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.